If you've ever attended a Bob Jones event, you know that you don't have much time but to talk and to think. But you learn a heck of a lot, and there's been some very engaging conversations, and Kristen, that was a wonderful talk that you gave, very thoughtful, and I'd like to talk to you about some of your 5 ideas. They're pretty terrific. When we talk about civic education, I think the line is quite different than the one that we started with this morning about philanthropy and volunteering when it comes to Florida. Because when it comes to Florida, I think that instead of seeing us as a state that is lagging, in many ways we're a state that is leading, and I hope we'll understand that better this afternoon. The need for civic education is critical in our country, and as Bob Graham mentioned earlier in the video that he so graciously was able to give, I think he made the point that we have disinvested over several generations in civic education, and that as a result we have seen a real lack of knowledge of government, real lack of knowledge of the elements of community affairs, lack of knowledge of how the economy works, lack of knowledge of what's happening in the world. The Annenberg Foundation several years ago did a they did a survey to find out what people knew about government. And one of the amazing things was that they found that only 1/3 of Americans could name the 3 branches of government. Few could name their own senators or their representatives. And a minority actually could identify who was in power in the House or in the Senate. So we certainly lack in our adult culture knowledge, basic knowledge of government. And then the National Educational Assessment, the Assessment of Educational Progress, found several years ago that when we actually test seniors in terms of basic adequacy in the area of civics, because we're testing in so many areas now, that they only 23% actually gain proficiency. But even more striking, and this I was struck by Camillo's comment from one table over here earlier, is that much of our capacity to engage in our culture has a lot to do with where we live and who our parents are. And so I think some recent studies have even shown that your performance in terms of your own civic knowledge and adequacy when you're a senior in high school will be 5 times greater if you live in certain areas of a community and in certain communities, and if your father and mother have gone to college. And so I think we need to be concerned about civic education as a class issue, as well as an issue for all of us, and we have to factor that into our thinking as we continue to look at what it is that we're trying to do and how are we trying to do it. In terms of Florida, I think we've been very fortunate in terms of having some great leadership from Bob Graham and many other leaders in the past decade to try to get us to turn the page and to improve our commitment to civic education. And we're going to be talking about some of that today. In a recent paper by Peter Levine, who we mentioned earlier, and one of his colleagues, it's a great paper. I think it was published last month, called "The Republic is Still at Risk, and Civics is a Part of the Solution." I think some of us have felt that it always has been. But when they begin to talk about what are the options and what are the best models in the country, in fact, they have turned he speaks of Illinois and Florida, and most particularly of Florida. So I hope we'll take a look at some of the good things we're doing. That's not to say that we are perfect or that we're hitting the ball out of the park even, but we're doing a lot better than other places. And I think we are one of only about a quarter of the states that really require tests for civic education competency, for example, and also that require courses in civic education. So we've made progress. We're doing some good things. We've got some serious challenges as well, however. To talk about some of the, to give you examples of some of the good things that are going on in Florida, I'd like to have a few of our showcases here. First, I want to know, is Chris Hand here? Has he made it yet? Okay, I'm sorry. He's may be with us in a few minutes. If not, I'll tell you about him and why he's important. But one of the finest programs in our state for a number of years is one that's been developed by Dr. Richard Murgo, who's the dean at Tallahassee Community College, who's done a wonderful modeling program on the United Nations, in which young people get an opportunity to deal with issues and debate them as if they were at the UN. So we're going to start by asking Richard if he would tell us a little bit about that program and what it's like and your perspective on it. Richard?
Good afternoon, everyone. As my co-panelists here are going to be presented in video, I'll try to keep my messages fairly brief as they cannot control theirs. There was a term used earlier this morning that I very much liked, and I'm going to steal throughout. I am a democracy addict as well. I started my academic career as a professor of political science. And part of that was my feeling that I wanted to not only teach young people the structure of their democratic system, but I also wanted to make them feel a part of it, as they have to be. They absolutely have to be. The structure component, those statistics are absolutely accurate in terms of what people, as young people, know about government. Anybody who spends more than 10 minutes in an introduction to political science class understands that there is very little understanding of the political system. It isn't taught. It is poorly taught, and we're doing nationally a very, very bad job of this. And obviously, it is my goal to see that this has changed. Young people have to understand the structure of government, and they've also got to have to be a part of it, which ties in what we were talking about this morning to this. There has to be community involvement. There has to be a sense of altruism. A democracy that's based on people who are purely self-motivated, on a constituency that only sees benefit to themselves, is a failing democracy. It cannot sustain itself. And if it does sustain itself, it ain't pretty. It's going to be an ugly democracy if it sustains itself on that basis. We have to instill in young people that sense of community involvement. And it was my goal to see that this was done. But what I learned from my students was that community, how I define community and how they define community was radically different. When I grew up, my community was my geographical surroundings. It was the city in which I grew up in, the neighborhood in which I grew up in, my high school, things of that nature. Young people today see a radically different community. Because of mass communication, because of the ability to communicate so well, obviously they're seeing a community that extends well beyond geographic. It is really irrelevant in terms of geographic. They're focused on ideas. They're focused on issues. This is their community. They come. When I see them come to the classroom, they're not interested in a specific geographical area. They are linked with students from all over the world, certainly all over the country and all over the state. This is their community. And this is how they've defined community. I'm very fortunate that I get to work with young people. I'm very fortunate I get to work with college students. I have learned time and time again that if given a challenge, if shown what a problem is, and part of civic education, if shown how to fix that problem, Young people are very willing to do this. They're very anxious to do this if given the opportunity. Based on that different definition of community, what I looked at was a very successful program that's called Model UN. Model UN is a program where students will simulate the United Nations. It's becoming radically very, very popular. It's done at the collegiate level, graduate school level. It's also done at the high school level. It's also done at the middle school level. It's so funny to see like 9-year-olds talking about nuclear nonproliferation. It's so weird. It's a good thing. It's done at all specific levels. Students will simulate the United Nations, and they have to do it based on specific issues that are facing the world, the same ones that the UN has not been successful in solving. We challenge students to be able to do it. They've got just as good a chance as probably as anybody else of doing this. But we challenge them on those specific issues. The program teaches them to speak. The program teaches them to do, obviously, research on a specific topic. And it also teaches them to look through the eyes of someone else. The only rule of Model UN is you cannot represent your own country. I've had my students passionately defend the policies of Iran, whereas I know most of them did not agree with the policies of Iran, but they understood perhaps why those policies maybe came about, why they had to do this. And they had to do this with representatives from Iran. We do this at the regional level. My students will host a conference for high schoolers. We do this at the state level. We have a state conference. There's a state organization of Model UN teams that is done at the collegiate level. I'm director of that here in Florida. It's done at the regional level, where we have about 400 or 500 students that collectively do this. And finally, it's done at the international level. Students meet in New York. 5,000 students a year meet at the actual United Nations. 70% of that program is represented by students outside the United States. So my students will be in conference with 5,000 other students representing coming from 144 different other countries. And they're able to see the world through different eyes. They're able to argue those and discuss those and build consensus. Through Model UN, they learn that consensus, the best and most durable consensus, is based on disagreement. Positive disagreement. When that positive disagreement comes about and students discuss adamantly, consensus is built. They have to build consensus, and they learn the skill of doing this. This is why it's been a very, very successful program. And when students are given a challenge, when students are shown a real problem, a real world problem, they're going to take it upon themselves not just to discuss it in a mock simulation. My students have gone on, when they find out about child mortality rate in Southeast Asia, my students have taken it upon themselves. I had 8 students figure out how to get 8 flights to go to Cambodia for the summer, and they worked in an orphanage in Cambodia. Last summer, I visited several of my students in Nicaragua who are working with single women who are trying to establish high technology businesses. When given a problem, students will become engaged. They have to be given the structure. They have to be given the structure of how this is done. And that community will filter down. They'll become active in their local communities. This is a muscle that you develop in young people. Once they develop that muscle, they will continue to do this. They'll continue to become engaged and involved, and they'll continue to participate within a democracy. Within Model UN, they learn about several specific issues. They'll learn about conflicts, obviously. World conflicts, which is obviously a component of this, but they also learn about issues affecting the environment, learn about human rights, and how it's badly distributed across the world. They learn about actual poverty, not sometimes what we conceive as poverty in the United States, but what real poverty is throughout the world, and they'll see it, and they'll have to discuss it. We're trying to build the skills of involvement in this, and it's become very, very successful. As students continue to do this, we're seeing, and I've seen them come time and time again, they stay involved in the community, and they stay involved in democracy. Been very, very effective. We're seeing it develop collegiately at all levels. And it's been a very, very good program. If I can answer any questions, possibly. It is done, they do it by competition. There are awards given. Students love the competition. College administrators like the competition because I tend to phrase this in sports terminology, and college administrators better understand that and fund a very, very expensive program for us. Football, yeah. We won the UN. Any questions I can answer? Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
You know, you have, in Florida, we are such a big place and such great distance, you end up having a lot of telephone friends. Well, here's one of my new friends, Chris. Hey, hi, Chris. We've been talking on the phone. I got a call last Friday from Bob Graham, and he says, I had met with him a couple weeks ago, and he's written a wonderful book, by the way. For those who don't know, it's called America, the Owner's Manual. You can fight City Hall and win. And the guy that he wrote the book with is Chris Hand, who's here with us. But it's not just to give a plug for the book, which I must say, as a former civics teacher, it's one of the best books I've ever seen, and a book that I've given to my grandchildren. I recommend recommend it to any of you who are looking for a good grandchildren gift. But Chris is here to tell us about another remarkable thing in Florida, and it's the passage of a Civic Education Act, which is very important to us in our future. So, Chris, glad you're here. Thanks.
Appreciate that very much. Thank you. Well, I promise Stuart is not getting any royalties, although maybe he should after that really wonderful plug for our book, America, the Owner's Manual. So thank you very much for that. Stuart and Bob, thank you very much. I just also want to acknowledge a couple of really good friends who are here. My good friend Doug Dobson, who's the executive director, and my also very good friend Dee Dee Rasmussen, there she is, who with Florida Campus Compact and Leon County School Board. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the passage of the Justice Sandra Day O'Connor Civics Education Act, because it really has laid the foundation for a lot of efforts. And first of all, thank you to everybody in this room for the efforts you're making to prioritize civic education in Florida, and particularly the education behind active citizenship in our state. Because a lot of people think that that's no longer possible in this country. Back in 2015, the Pew Research Center did a study of Americans' attitudes toward government, and they found that 74% of those surveyed, 74%, three-quarters, believe that elected officials no longer care what people like us think. Well, there's a lot of reasons for that. One is you see what's happening in Washington and in all 50 state capitals, and you understand that attitude a little bit. But it's also because, as everyone in this room knows, generally over the last several decades, we as Americans haven't been trained in the skills of effective citizenship to make elected officials care what we think. And that is why Senator Graham and I wrote America, the Owner's Manual, which helps to sort of fill in the gap, to provide those top 10 skills of effective citizenship, and most importantly, to tell the stories of everyday Americans who have used those skills of effective citizenship to make government respond. Whether it was the somewhat unlikely coalition between the Tea Party and the Sierra Club in Georgia to make that state the Sunshine State in fact, a very pro-solar state, or whether it was the work of Barbara Capitman to save historic Art Deco structures in South Beach, Florida, whether it was the work of University of Missouri football students who forced change on their campus in the fall of 2015, responding to concerns about racism on campus. There are many stories out there of Americans who have made change, and everybody in this room, I know, is committed and has shown that they are committed to giving Americans those skills so they can go out and make change. But we wrote this book largely when Senator Graham, as he likes to say, when he was in Miami Senior High School in the 1950s, he tended to have 3 one-year courses in civics. Well, today, obviously, the frequency of teaching civics has dropped considerably. And where it is taught, it tends to be more spectator civics. What are the names of the 3 branches of government? How does a bill become a law? Than it does to be participatory civics. Some of the examples we just saw on the screen here that Florida Campus Compact and many of you are working on each day. And so a lot of this concern originally came together about a decade ago, and what it became was the Justice Sandra Day O'Connor Civics Education Act. And I want to walk you through that odyssey just a little bit because, again, I think it's a very important foundation to all the efforts that are being talked about here today. Just to kind of set the stage, about a decade ago, Florida ranked 47th in its Civic Health Index. And to just not to put too fine a point on that, we were 32nd in average voter turnout. We were 40th in the percentage of our citizens who've worked with neighbors to solve a community problem, 47th in the percentage of citizens who have actually attended a public meeting, and 50th in the rate of volunteering, therefore ending up in that rate of 47 in terms of our civic health index. Well, a lot of people were concerned about that, and just one resource I'd recommend to everybody, if you want to read the story of how this act was passed, if you go check out what's called CIRCLE, an organization I know many people here are familiar with, the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement. They've written a really good case study on the passage of this bill. But again, just to kind of take you back about a decade, in 2006, the legislature passed a law mandating civic education in middle schools. But as is often the case, with that law, without the proper accountability measures, it was unclear whether that mandate would ever be fulfilled. So in late 2006, Senator Graham, who had just opened the Bob Graham Center for Public Service at the University of Florida, and former Congressman Lou Frye through the Lou Frye Center at the University of Central Florida, got together and said, we want to help do something about this problem to make sure that this mandate actually becomes something that's practiced in Florida classrooms. So the first thing they did was form an institution that everyone here is now familiar with, the Florida Joint Center for Citizenship, to help advance these ideas and ultimately to provide a place where that could help to train teaching professionals and others how to advance these concepts of active citizenship. And then moved the push for the legislation to first make sure that civics was taught by having it be part of the end-of-course testing that occurred in many subjects in Florida, and also to make sure that it was fully integrated into the curriculum here in the state. So the Justice Sandra Day O'Connor Civics Education Act came together largely through a lot of the elements of active citizenship, and I want to talk about a few of those today. First of all, every citizen initiative has to have the right quarterback, the person who is, or persons, who are pushing this day after day, who are there on the ground, making decisions, seeing what kind of defense is set up, calling audibles as need be. And that person was right here in this room. That's Doug Dobson, who logged hours and hours in Tallahassee. I think Doug could probably drive from Orlando to Tallahassee blindfolded at this point, given all the time he spent up there. So you've got to have the right quarterback. You've got to have the broad coalition of support. I mentioned Dee Dee earlier, and she was very involved in this effort. But there were a broad range of people who were brought into this civics education curriculum, as broad as former Governor Jeb Bush, the Florida Law-Related Education Association, the Florida Association of Social Studies Supervisors, League of Women Voters, Common Cause. The list goes on, and I'm sure including a lot of people in this room. And any successful citizen initiative where you're trying to get elected officials to actually pass something requires legislative champions. And in this case, we were very lucky to have two very talented ones. One, a state senator from Sarasota named Nancy Dietert, who's now a member of the Sarasota County Commission. And second, a state representative from my hometown of Jacksonville named Charles McBurney, who is now an attorney in private practice and actually running for circuit judge in 2018. The two of them committed to make this the top of their legislative priority list. And starting in 2007, through Doug and Dee Dee and other people's efforts, began to push this through the legislature. Well, like any good governmental initiative, it did not pass on the first try, didn't even pass on the second try. But as the team continued to work this through the process, through their legislative champions, they built up more and more momentum. And then got over the finish line by attracting a key ally. And that key ally, as I alluded to earlier through the name, was the recently retired former Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor, who decided that she was going to make her post-Supreme Court mission trying to spread civics education throughout the United States. She came and addressed a joint session of the legislature in 2009, and that helped to give all of these efforts and coalitions that had been formed the final push that they needed to get across the finish line. And in 2010, the Justice Sandra Day O'Connor Civics Education Act passed, and today, of course, is the foundation for how civics tends to be taught in public schools, particularly middle schools, here in the state of Florida. And, you know, there's a lot of laws that pass in Tallahassee that are not successful or that don't achieve their required goals. Well, this is one where quantitatively we know that it has worked. And I'll give you some of those statistics just as I wrap up here. Well, this mandate passed, and obviously, because civics had not been a sort of a predominant part of the curriculum for many years, there were a number of teachers and others who needed to sort of learn what the latest pedagogy was, what are some of the teaching methods we need to use, and into that stepped the Florida Joint Center for Citizenship, which over the last decade, or almost decade now, since the act was passed, has provided in-service training, developed instructional materials that more than 5,000 teachers have used, and have provided more than 95,000 hours in online instruction in civics. I mentioned when I was talking about the act that one of its key components was this end-of-course testing, again, like with many other subjects in Florida, that was part of the legislation. Well, just to give you a sense of how successful the act has been, in 2014, 23% of students, 8th graders nationwide, were considered to be proficient in civics as a result of a national assessment on the subject. 23% nationwide. In Florida, 61% of students enrolled in 7th grade civics scored at or better a proficient level. So Florida at that point is 40 points above the nation. And in 2017, the numbers got even better. Florida tested at 69% of 7th graders who were at or above that proficient level. And in fact, students whose teachers used materials prepared by the Florida Joint Center for Citizenship saw their scores 25% higher than those who were not. That is legislation that is working to help increase its goal, and exactly what was intended when when the Graham Center and the Lou Fry Center formed the Florida Joint Center for Citizenship, and this legislative coalition came together. I know we are not supposed to get too deep into this today, but just for your further food for thought, I'm sure many people in this room are aware that the Florida Joint Center for Citizenship was a state-funded organization until this last session in the Florida legislature, when the legislature cut funding for the Joint Center by half, and then the governor vetoed the other half of the Joint Center's funding. So one thing I would commit to everybody here is there was a great success in Tallahassee in 2010, built by many years of work. I hope there are even more great successes to come in helping to make sure that the Florida Joint Center and the great work that it's doing, the great work that everyone in this room is doing to help power civic education will move forward. So thank you very much for your time today, and thank you for the great work you do on behalf of civics education in Florida. So.